August 15th, 2013. I stood in my mother's bedroom with one of her good knives in my right hand. I was contemplating on where to cut myself. See, I'm a bit vain, so I had to be strategic. There were three spots of criteria that this act needed to meet. I had to pick a spot on my body where my doctor or a lover or my tattoo artist wouldn't raise questions about the scars. After an hour or so of thinking and pressing the blade to my skin just enough not to pierce the flesh, I gave up, placed the knife on the bed, and went downstairs to be with my mother. After slowly walking down the stairs, through the kitchen and the hallway, I made my way into the front room where my mother was sitting. Her legs were crossed at the ankle and swinging in a back and forth motion. I stood next to her and attempted to fix my eyes on one of the many beautiful plants that my mother has in her living room. The house was finally quiet. It was just I and she alone for the first time in hours. Then I broke the news. And from what I can recall, I think it was something like, I was just upstairs with a knife, debating on where to cut myself. My mother closed her eyes tightly, then calmly replied, "You know what that's about, right? That's not going to let the pain out. You know your brother wouldn't want you to do that." See, about 15 hours before I made that confession to my mother, my youngest brother, John Douglas Gorman, Jr., at the age of 27 years old, was murdered just blocks away from our mother's home. While I am the middle child by birth order, the death of my brother added a new layer to this position. The night my brother was murdered, I was actually in New York. So I boarded the first flight out, draped my pashima over my face to hide my tears from the concerned flight attendant, and drifted off to sleep because the uncertainty I was flying into was just a little too much to handle. After landing and then collapsing into my mother's arms at the sight of her, I found myself in the middle of my family and my neighborhood's disbelief. My mother's incomprehensible pain at night turned her body into a convulsing earthquake of tears and wailing that seemed to go on forever as I lay next to her. When I broke the news to our dad over the phone, there was a heavy silence. This was a particular type of heartbreak since his mother had just taken her last breath 3 short months prior as I was painting her fingernails the day after my birthday. And in 1993, my father's oldest son, our brother Javon, was murdered after being home for less than 2 months following his military duty in Kuwait. In the days that followed, I went on autopilot, dictated the words from my brother's obituary to a friend over the phone, then edited the copy and creative directed the obituary, feeling totally numbed out in a sense of urgency. With permission from my family, I pulled a team of mental and emotional health professionals together for my brother's repast. Trapped between fear and hypervigilance, praying that the media wouldn't criminalize my brother, because when folks hear or read fatal shooting in St. Louis and black male, conclusions get drawn, judgment is passed, and the loss of life is diminished. Don't believe me? Just read the comments section. The day before the funeral, I ended up on the floor in front of my brother's casket, confused on how I got there, profusely apologizing to my mother for not being strong enough, and the funeral director softly telling my mother, "Let her lay there until she can pick herself up." During the burial, the sight of our grandmother's urn and my brother's casket paralyzed me. And there I was in the middle with family members and friends gently pulling at me and pleading with me to let go. And as unrealistic as it is, I was straddling the thought of how do I be myself and my brother too. When things became still, I attempted to find a support system because when I held that knife in my hand in my mother's bedroom, I knew something about me had dramatically changed. I knew I needed to speak with someone who could understand what I was going through. So just over a month after my brother's funeral, I returned back to New York for business, and during lunch with a friend who lost his brother to cancer, it hit me that not all sibling loss is equal, especially when that sibling has been taken violently. And it's not like cancer is a living, breathing person you can demand answers from. No matter how tempting the thought is, it just can't be done. See, my brother, while 8 years my junior, was my protector, and we were finally becoming friends. After his murder, the world felt unsafe and unstable and unpredictable. Paranoia crept in. Nightmares were constant because while I was not there, details told to our family from witnesses and perhaps a psychic connection to my brother revealed certain things to me. Fast forward to 5 days shy of my brother's death anniversary, Michael Brown Jr. was murdered. His death haunted me for obvious human rights reasons, but the visual of him lying on the ground did something awful to me. My mind transposed the image of my brother laying on that ground in Brown's place. Then more layers were peeled back. The death of my brother resurfaced traumas I tried to stuff away. For siblings who have lost their siblings to violent crime, whether blood-related or through fictive kinship bonds, many of us have never known our lives without our siblings. If you're younger, you're grieving a person you've never known life without. If you're older, you replay your siblings' entire life over and over again in your head, and you start to blame yourself for doing the things that older siblings do. On top of the initial loss in the funeral, many siblings like myself also have to endure the process of trial and sentencing. The time leading up to court proceedings, the duration and trial and sentencing procedures can reopen wounds that were never fully healed and derail life once again. Nothing could have ever prepared me for being accidentally exposed to a picture of my brother's body in the morgue. And no amount of public speaking could have primed me to read a victim impact statement before the court and the young man who took my brother's life. Earlier this year, I attended a luncheon put on by the Women's Democratic Forum where gun violence was the topic. The prosecuting attorney of St. Louis City showed a board with the first names and ages of 178 people whose lives were lost alone to gun violence in 2015. Now, let's say at minimum, each of these people had one sibling, at most, say about 2 to 3 blood or fictitious kinship bonds. That's a range of 178 to 534 siblings spanning the spectrum of age who are affected by the loss of a sibling, and that's just to gun violence alone. Total homicides, according to the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department for 2016 so far, is at 176 people. This means, as it stands, there are between 176 and 528 more are repeatedly traumatized siblings in our city. While doing research specifically regarding how violent crime affects siblings, I spoke with the head of victim services. A bit stumped by my inquiry, she said, "You know what? I'm sorry. We don't collect that data. Maybe we should." And she is not the only person who has been caught off guard by my search. And one thing has become clear to me over these last 3 years. Those of us who have lost our siblings to violent crime, our trauma is on the margins of the radar. Hopefully, that changes today. What if the secondary trauma siblings endure is the missing piece to understanding and reversing suicide in certain populations? What about possibly turning the tide on high school dropout rates and incarceration rates? What if our experiences hold the key to planning and building trauma-sensitive communities that also informs how prosecutors and judges present cases and administer care to the entire family of victims? What if those of us who are caught in the middle hold solutions to heal the whole? What if?